Good evening. This is the Ecology Hour on KZYX 88.1 Fort Bragg, 90.7 Philo, 91.5 Willits and Ukiah, Mendocino County's public and community radio, and it is 7 p.m. Well, a very warm welcome to this evening's Ecology Hour. I will be your host this evening, Hannah Bird. We're going to start this evening's Ecology Hour meeting perhaps some of the lesser preferred residents of California, the tick population. We're going to be interviewing Emily Pascoe, Ph.D., from the University of California, Davis, in the Department of Veterinary Medicine and Epidemiology. Now, Emily has been studying ticks on the site here at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, in particular in relation to their host relationships and also how those hosts and the ticks have been affected after the river fire burned through the site in 2018. It's worth noting that during the coronavirus pandemic, we have been recording outside in order to keep everybody safe. And in the interview with Emily Pascoe, we are joined by a number of wildlife species and in some cases a rooster. So apologies for some of the additional sounds during the interview with Emily Pascoe, but I think we can still get a great take on what she's been studying on the site. We're then going to follow up that interview with another look at fire-related research with PhD student Kendal Calhoun from UC Berkeley, who's also looking at wildlife populations and their response to the river fire from 2018. This interview with Kendal Calhoun is an archive recording from the Ecology Hour and was recorded in the summer of 2019. We're going to be revisiting the work from Kendal Calhoun in the next month's Ecology Hour. So let's get started with Emily Pascoe from UC Davis. I started by asking what drew her to study such a strange and interesting area as ticks and tick-borne disease.
Yes, so I am what's known as a postdoctoral researcher, so just basically a researcher after the PhD at the University of California, Davis, and I researched the ecology of ticks and tick-borne pathogens. And so that's what brought me here to Hopland. There is a lot of interesting diversity here in the tick species, but also the host species, so you have a lot of small mammals here, and you also have some of the pathogens that I'm interested in here, so Borrelia, which is the Lyme disease pathogen. And specifically I'm here because of the river fire that happened here in 2018. I'm interested in looking at how the fire has potentially changed the ecology of the ticks and tick-borne pathogens here, which and that project's being led by Professor Bob Lane from the University of California, Berkeley.
Excellent. So, straight in there, studying ticks. I'm guessing that isn't everybody's favourite study area. Can you tell me what drew you? And I'm guessing also that it wasn't that you were a kid and you just thought, I just can't wait to study ticks. What's led you in this direction? How have you ended up looking at this particular area?
Well, I've always been fascinated with biology and ecology and parasites as well, because they're kind of this often unseen force that has this huge impact on the ecology of the species that they infect. And then ticks are no exception to that, and they're particularly interesting. So in order for humans to get infected with the tick-borne pathogen, so in order, for example, for a human to be infected with the Lyme disease bacteria, there is this really specific set of circumstances for that to happen. So you have to have that the tick has previously bitten an animal that was infected, and you have to have then that tick survives to the next stage of its life cycle and then bites a human and passes on the bacteria. So the ecology is kind of complex, and that is really interesting for me, trying to understand those components.
So I should comment that we are recording outside today, and so we have all the wonderful sounds of wildlife at the Hopland Research and Extension Center. We've just had some acorn woodpeckers, and I think just a pileated woodpecker drumming just then too. So just wanted to let our listeners know that we do have some other folks who are in on the interview with us today. So Emily, maybe not everybody's immediate chosen subject area, but studying ticks is obviously a fascinating area. Studying parasites is fascinating, but I'm interested, before we get really in depth to it, as to, have you studied other parasitic relationships? Again, I'm fascinated in that journey you must have taken to get you to this level of depth at looking at the parasite-host relationship.
Yes, so I have always been interested in how parasites affect the ecology of their hosts, and I've also researched how other ectoparasites, so those are the parasites on the outside of the body, have impacted other species. Ticks and fleas and lice, particularly in small mammals. And then I've also researched the endoparasites, so those are the parasites inside the body. And so looking at the tapeworms and things like that, also in small mammals, and how they have interacted with the microbiota, so that's the community of bacteria and other microorganisms in the gut, and how the two interact and impact the host.
So, looking at all of these different parasite relationships, are you frequently drawing parallels or trying to better understand how this might impact public health for humans as well? Is there often a connection in that area, or?
Yes, so when I was looking at the interaction between the parasites within the gut and the microbiota community, that was within a small mammal, so a mouse, but it was with the idea that could be used as a model system for any mammal in general. But I guess that more so with the ticks, that's more applicable to humans. Otherwise, more just interested in the ecology in general.
Yeah, and I bring that up purely because I can't help but at some point in this interview to go down that track of, you know, as humans, we all also appreciate that sometimes we are the host for a tick, and concerns about Lyme disease are obviously something which gives people anxiety. And, you know, just in the last week, I've managed to find 3 of them around my house or on one of my children. So, you know, we are aware of it, and it's something that gives us cause for concern. So let's go back to the studies that you've been doing here recently. And what you've been particularly interested in is the fact that, as you mentioned, there was a wildfire that came through here in 2018, the river fire, that's burned areas that had historically been studied to look at tick populations. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, that's correct. So Professor Bob Blaine had studied the area that we are now working in really extensively before the fire, and he has a lot of data on the ticks and the pathogens and the tick hosts before the fire there. So.
Wow. So having access to that long-term historical data is of value now, because you're able to see how the fire has actually changed that population, correct?
Yeah, it's really valuable because normally, obviously, these wildfires are really unpredictable, so it's quite rare that we are able to have something to compare the post-fire data to pre-fire data, and that's kind of important because we need to know what the scenario and the situation was like before the fire, so we can truly understand the effect that the fire has had.
Have there been other studies looking at how wildfire and tick populations interrelate?
Yes, there have been other studies, including in California, but not with such an extensive pre-fire, if any pre-fire data at all, as we are lucky to have in this situation. So.
Excellent. So, okay, this is the other thing I always find really interesting on the Ecology Hour, and maybe it's just me, but I'm always interested about what does it actually take when you're going out to do field work, especially if you're going out to do field work to find ticks. And how is that a challenge to also not getting ticks? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so we are lucky in this case that we have, there's a big group of us working on this particular project. So Professor Bob Lane is responsible for the pure, let's say, tick collection in the environment part. So he goes out periodically with a tick flag, which is like a metre by metre square piece of white cotton that is dragged over the environment, and in theory ticks should, questing ticks, so those are the ticks that are waiting for their host to pass by. They climb to the top of a piece of vegetation and just hang out there until the host passes by and latches on.
And that's called questing.
Questing,
I
yes.
love that term. It sounds so Game of Thrones.
So he collects questing ticks by dragging this piece of material over them, which they should confuse as a host, I suppose, and hold on to that. And then I am looking at the ticks on the small mammals, so like the mice and the squirrels and other kind of small mammals population, and also the lizard population. So that involves catching mice in humane traps overnight. So we release them afterwards, and that's our intention, because we want to see how the number of ticks they have changes over time. And then with the lizards, I do what's called noosing, which is very similar to, it's almost like fishing on dry land for lizards. And again, we give them a little number so we know which mouse or which lizard is who, and then we release them and hope to catch them in the future and see who's gotten ticks again. So.
Wow. So, of these different wildlife species that you're talking about, what is there a kind of wildlife that we know of as they are the main host for ticks? They're a really crucial host.
It's interesting because you have two different hosts which are important in the Lyme disease cycle. So squirrels are really important because they actually are what we call reservoir hosts for the actual Lyme disease pathogen. So they get infected with the Lyme disease bacteria, and it multiplies within them. And so when the next tick bites them, that tick is really likely to get infected. And then when that tick drops off and then bites a human, that human has a high chance of getting the Lyme disease pathogen. Mm-hmm. And so lizards are also interesting, and they have almost like a dual role in the Lyme disease cycle, in that compared to the squirrels, they host many more ticks. So if I catch a lizard, I will find typically more than 20 ticks on it, versus a mouse or a squirrel that will just have a handful of ticks. So that's bad in terms of the fact that obviously the more ticks that a lizard has, the more chances there are that one of those ticks will then go on to bite a human at a later life stage. On the other hand, and this was actually discovered by Professor Bob Lane, the lizards have a special protein in their blood which clears the ticks of the Borrelia, the Lyme disease pathogen infection. So although thanks to lizards there may be more ticks in the environment, the chances are they'll not be infected with the Lyme disease pathogen. So there might be more ticks to bite humans, but the humans are less likely to actually get the Lyme disease pathogen. So.
Wow. So this lizard blood has something in it that somehow just kills off that pathogen.
Yes, it's a protein in the blood that does that.
Wow. And I guess the other thing I'm interested in, and in a minute I'd love to just get your kind of beginner's guide to the tick life cycle, please, because I still struggle with that. But it's also interesting to me that they can use both reptiles and mammals as hosts. Kind of, is that unusual, or can?
Yeah, so there are different types, different species of tick. Some are more what we would call generalist, so they can feed on lizards and small mammals, and as well as deer and larger mammals. And the western black-legged tick is an example of that. And then we also have here what we call nidicolous ticks. And they are really interesting. So if you remember, I mentioned this questing behaviour earlier, where they walk to the top of a piece of vegetation and wait for a host to pass by and latch on. Nidicolous ticks actually instead spend their almost, if not all, of their life cycle inside the nest or a den of the host, and they therefore tend to be more specialised to feeding on just a few species. So one of them is pretty specialised to feed just on wood rats and will remain in the nest of a wood rat.
Wow. And we get those ticks around here as well?
Yes.
But we probably don't come into contact with them much because
very
they're
rarely.
busy in their host nest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah, would you mind giving us the kind of beginner's guide to the tick life cycle?
Yes, so ticks actually lay eggs, and the eggs will hatch into a larva, and they can be distinguished from the other life stages because they just have 3 pairs of legs, whereas the nymphs and the adults each have 4 pairs of legs, and they're really very tiny. Maybe you have seen these kind of CDC images from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where they have images of poppy seeds, and they're basically the same size. They're really, really tiny. And in order for the larvae to progress to the next life stage, they have to have a blood meal. And they will kind of take their blood meal, and then they typically kind of burrow under leaf litter or somewhere like that, and will kind of go into diapause.
Or explain that for me.
They will. It's almost. I guess you can consider it almost like a hibernation. So they do very little. They don't move. They don't feed. They're just there, kind of waiting to molt, so to shed their outer layer and become nymphs. Mm-hmm. And so the same thing with nymphs. They also must take a blood meal to be able to molt into adults. And then the adult female must take a blood meal before she can lay her eggs.
Okay, I see. So each stage of the cycle will need that tick to parasitize on something and to get a blood meal.
Exactly. And it's during that blood meal that the tick will become infected with, for example, the Lyme disease pathogen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm interested, of course, because, I know that I myself have found a number of ticks in the last few weeks around my family. And sometimes I found very, very tiny ones, the ones that I would never have even noticed if it hadn't been that, we were just at the right time at the right place. So is that stage, the tiny stage, is that the larva? What would I be finding at that point?
Yes.
How big are they?
So larvae are really small, and they often are difficult to notice. Nymphs also can be, sometimes easily missed if you're checking yourself.
So I guess let me see. So I'm fascinated by this cycle. So, and then the adults will lay eggs typically on the ground in leaf litter. Is that where the eggs are laid as well?
Yes. So for most species, leaf litter is really important, or with these nidicolous ticks that stay in the den, less so, because they have the kind of microenvironment of the wood rat nest or whichever species it is. But the leaf litter is important because ticks actually dry out quite easily. They suffer from dehydration, and under the leaf litter you have this humidity that allows them to survive under there. So.
I think you're the first person that's made me feel at all sorry for ticks, because you've told me they dehydrate easily. So here's something that my kids frequently ask me, because I'm always telling them about, everything has a role in ecology. Every living thing is part of this big, incredible web of life that relies on each other. And quite frequently they ask me, but what good do ticks do, Mummy? So, Emily, can you answer this big question, which I have on a very frequent basis? What's the benefit of having them in our ecology?
Well, they certainly provide me something very interesting to study, but I'm not sure that your children will find that explanation adequate enough. So they do provide food for some animals. Certainly, mice, for example, and opossums will eat the ticks when they are grooming, but I wouldn't say that really makes up a significant part of their food or their nutrition intake. There are some invertebrates, I believe, some ants feed on ticks. I wouldn't be able to say if they provide, again, an adequate proportion of their food intake, but they certainly provide some food for some animals. So.
Great. Okay, I have an answer now. I think they still are going to be asking me, but could we manage without them? But that's okay. That's a whole other. So, okay. So here's something that I think when you're going out and you're looking for these host animals and you're studying those, and in some cases you must likely be, while you're studying that, in fairly tick-heavy habitat, or potentially so. I guess since you're in burned areas now, maybe that's not the case, but we'll come to that. So how do you protect yourself, and what can we learn from you? Like, what are your top 5 tips for avoiding ticks?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because although obviously I may be more exposed than the average person because I'm really getting in and into the vegetation and into the tick habitat, what I do is also very useful for every person who spends time outdoors to do as well, because you could also be very at risk. So although it's less of an option for me because of where I need to go to place my traps, certainly staying on trails is really important, because when they do this questing behaviour, they are often hanging out in tall grass or vegetation. So trying to avoid those kind of areas, which is, often trails are either dirt or not vegetated, so that kind of walkway is less likely to have questing ticks on it. So staying on trails. I always tuck my pants into my socks.
That's a good fashion statement.
Yes. And because they often will be sort of between ankle and knee height when they're questing, so it's easy for them to get onto your shoes or your socks and then just crawl up your trouser or pant legs. And then having your trousers tucked into your socks obviously makes that a little bit more difficult for them. And obviously sort of long sleeves, long trousers. And if you have pale clothing, white trousers or, other pale clothes, that's really useful because you can more easily spot the ticks. And then really frequent tick checks. So I frequently, every hour or so, take a check on my trousers, see if I see any, on my arms, wherever I'm able to see. And then as soon as I'm back from the field, I take a hot shower and then have a really good look at my all of my body. So.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, that's wonderful. And we'll return to your top 5 tick tips at the end of the interview, but that's really useful. And I think at this time of year, when especially, we're all trying to enjoy being outside as much as we can right now, I think that's a really useful thing. So, Emily, I wonder if I can ask you a little more about the kinds of diseases that we have seen transmitted by ticks, or pathogens that we've seen. We tend to think of Lyme disease as the primary one, but there are others as well. Is that something that you know much of or would be able to share with us much?
Yeah, so Lyme disease is the most frequently reported tick-associated disease in California. So the others I'm talking about are less frequent, so less, in that respect at least, less concerning. We also have the anaplasma pathogen here, so that's the bacteria which causes human granulocytic anaplasmosis. We also have the Rocky Mountain spotted fever pathogen, more in the south of California. And those are sort of obviously, plus Lyme disease, those are the 3 main ones that we have in the state.
So, and bearing in mind that your area of study is not the medical treatment of any of these things, I think that's really important to recognize that you're studying the ecology and how they're behaving with their hosts. But along the same lines of, we know that people are getting outdoors. We know that on occasions they are finding ticks on themselves that maybe have even dug in, and they may be concerned about transmission of these diseases. Do you have any advice for folks who are who have been bitten or are concerned about what they should do?
So the main thing is not to immediately panic, because it usually takes a while for a lot of the tick-associated diseases for the tick to actually transmit enough of the pathogen to make you sick. So that's why checking yourself frequently and checking yourself as soon as you come back in a hot shower for ticks on you is so good, because it gives you that opportunity to quickly remove it and hopefully stop the disease in its tracks, if you will. If you do find a tick on yourself, the important thing is not to do sort of any of these things you might read online, like I've heard of people saying that they sprayed the tick with perfume to kill it and burning it with a lighter and things like that. The best thing you can do is to take a pair of tweezers and, as close to the skin as possible, grasp the tick and pull it out, and then to scrub the area with soap afterwards. It's really useful if you keep that tick either in the best place to keep it is on a piece of tape, so just stick it on a piece of tape, and then you've got that tick there then, so if at a later date you do become sick, you can take that tick to the doctor and show it to them, and they can either test it for pathogens, then they can hopefully understand more quickly what might be wrong with you. And then I would just say keep a really close eye on how you're feeling for at least 2 weeks after the bite, so looking for any new rashes. If you're feeling at all that you have a fever or in any way unwell, to go to the doctor and really sort of insist that they take any symptoms seriously, because one of the issues with tick-borne or tick-associated diseases is that they often have very what we call non-specific symptoms. So a lot of times people just feel a little bit off. They have a bit of a headache, they have a bit of a fever, and they don't really know what it is. They can't really pinpoint any specific issue, and that's what makes it often very difficult to diagnose them.
That's really helpful, because I think often we think about keeping the tick or immediately taking it in for testing, whether or not it was even dug in, but actually what's useful is to keep it and know that if you did then need to get something looked into, if you're at all concerned, you've got it so it can be tested.
Yes.
It's a very sensible way of going about things.
Yes, and I wouldn't recommend at all waiting. As soon as if you have any concern at all that you might be sick, go straight to your doctor, because they're often much easier to treat if they're dealt with quickly.
So bringing us back, perhaps, and I appreciate you being willing to share all of that information with me, because of course you can't talk about ticks without thinking about how we can be protected and all the impacts that could be if they do use a human as a host. But what you've been studying particularly here is on this burned area. And so I guess, from a naive viewpoint, it strikes me that when an area has been burned, surely there's not much living there afterwards, and that would mean that there isn't much chance for the ticks in the area. So we're talking 2 years on now. Does it sound right what I'm saying? What kind of things are you finding, or is that part of what you're trying to understand?
Yes, so that's certainly what we are trying to understand. We're still in the process of collecting samples and understanding the data, so I can't really give you a definitive answer yet, but what I can tell you is that the habitat that was there previously, so there was a lot of leaf litter, a lot of tree canopy cover, is no longer there, and we're now seeing much different habitat. We're seeing a lot of grasses come in and other types of vegetation, so that would certainly suggest that things have changed.
So you mentioned the western black-legged ticks and also the nidicolous ticks.
Yeah.
So which species are ones which are most likely to transmit Lyme disease?
So the western black-legged tick is the main, let's say, bad one, because it's a generalist feeder, so it's more likely to feed on your on the infected squirrels, and and then to feed on humans at a later date at their next life stage. So they tend to be the ones most commonly infected or transmitting also the pathogen.
Okay. And how many different species of ticks do we have around here, approximately?
Oh, I believe in the whole of California there's at least 50.
Oh, goodness me. Okay.
But
wow.
some are, like I say, very special. Some feed just on birds and are never really seen at all near humans. So, yeah.
Wow. Just a reminder that the time is 7:30 and you are listening to the Ecology Hour on KZYX. We'll return to our interview now with Emily Pascoe, considering how ticks play their role in the ecology of California. Is that part of what is a fascination for you, an interest for you, is just the complexity of these parasite-host relationships? Because you say there's 50 different species in California, and then that some of them are very specialist as to which host. Is that something that is like a particular area of interest for you?
Yeah, so it is this kind of the difference in the role that they play in the risk to humans and just in general in ecology. How that differs between the generalist feeders and the more specialised feeders is really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, so at some point I should reference the fact, Emily, that you and I have similar accents, and we
Yes.
come from vaguely the same part of the world, from the UK. So do ticks exist pretty much all over the world? Are they on every continent, or where do we not see ticks?
Yeah, so they are everywhere. They are in Europe, they are on, I'm pretty sure that they are on every continent. California is exceptional in that there is high diversity in the species of ticks that we do have here, as well as in the host species. So we have diversity in squirrel species and mice species and other tick hosts, and then also in the pathogens, so in the type of Lyme disease pathogens and other tick associated disease pathogens. So we are different here, let's say.
Having that great biodiversity that we do have here allows for a great diversity of parasites as well, I guess. That
Yes.
just goes,
Yeah.
they go with each other. Yeah. So what's the next steps for you on this particular study?
So we are just wrapping up now our second year of sampling here, and I think we will be taking a look at the data and trying to understand what it is that we can what patterns we can see and what story there is to tell. So.
Can you see ways that I guess whenever you're working with tick species that does have a public health element, a human public health element, this is valuable data for us to better understand how diseases are transmitted and what impacts how much it's likely to be an issue in particular areas, correct?
Yes, so as we've kind of said, it's extremely complicated and complex how a tick can make a human sick. You have kind of all of the in-between life stages and the getting infected stage and things like that. And so consequently, a lot of studies and a lot of information goes into just a tiny bit of more understanding of what that means for humans. So hopefully what we are doing will be one of those tiny pieces of information that helps to give us a better picture of what the risks are to humans under different scenarios.
The other thing I'm interested in is when you look online, you can find a lot of things about ticks, but I'm always a little nervous about what might be real and what might be what we were saying about spraying perfume on ticks or whatever it was, right? Where are the best places that you would suggest online for folks to find out more about how to be safe and what the risks are?
So the CDC, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, is kind of the authority for the whole of the US, and that's a good site to check out. And if you're more interested in understanding more locally what is relevant, then the California Department for Public Health is a very good resource. They have a lot of information there that's worth to check out.
Excellent. Do you have other parasite relationships that you find that you're really fascinated by that you think you may go on to study in the future? I'm intrigued. What's your...
I do really enjoy learning about the tapeworms and things like that, because when you tell people that's what you're studying, you always get a very interesting facial expression in response. And the fact that these really hidden, almost unknown parasites, you don't realise you have them, have such an impact is kind of interesting to me. So,
and all of these parasites are also rather fascinating in their success, right?
Yes.
They all seem to be doing really quite well.
Yes.
You know, and especially those that, I suppose those that have managed to cross and can use humans as hosts as well. Those are the ones that we tend to know the most about, but they seem to be doing pretty well.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's always fascinated to me as well that it still seems like, as far as our understanding of them goes, there's still a lot for us to learn. As a study area, is it a kind of lesser study area? Not many people are working in this area, or I just feel like it seems like there's still so much to know, and maybe that's more of an expression of the complexity of their relationships.
I think that there are a lot of different research groups doing some really great work, but there is so much complexity involved that it takes a lot of work from a lot of different groups studying very specific parts to group all that information together and to actually be able to tell the story. So,
well, thank you for being one of the scientists who's doing that work, because we all benefit from it. Thank you for putting yourself out there and taking the risks as well of being in tick-heavy habitat. I guess I have to share at the end of this that I was enjoying being in a park back just before coronavirus, and I loved their interpretive signage, which was obviously trying to make you not go through a particular field that they had, and it just had a sign looked as if it was covered in ticks, and it said tick infested area. And I thought, wow, that sign's going to put anybody off from going anywhere near. Well, Emily, I hope you might join us again on the Ecology Hour in the future and tell us more about what you've discovered here. Is there anything else that you'd want to add? Anything I've missed that you think would be really important to share with our listeners?
No, just don't let ticks put you off enjoying the outdoors. As long as you take precautions and check carefully, there is no reason that you can't still enjoy walking outside.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think sometimes it does make us think, oh, it's too much, we can't possibly go, but there's so much to explore and enjoy out there, and the health benefits are huge, right?
Exactly.
In doing that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to Emily. What a great review of how ticks impact the ecology of California and how they impact their hosts, and also how they're affected by wildfire. It's great to have Emily continuing her studies here on the site at the Hopland Research and Extension Centre. We're now going to move on to interviewing Ph.D. candidate Kendal Calhoun from UC Berkeley Brashares Lab, who is studying again how wildfire, the river fire that burned through the site here in 2018, has been impacting wildlife species. Okay, so let's get started with you, Kendall. You've been studying here at Hopland for a little bit of time now. Can I ask you, what was it that attracted you to Hopland to conduct your research?
Yeah, I think it's maybe two big pieces that attracted me to come here to do my research for my PhD. The first being the Mendocino complex fire, which I guess the river fire being part of that came down and to burn about half of the property. Just presents a really interesting natural experiment to explore how wildlife are responding to fire, which is something that I've been looking for.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's very hard to come by.
So as, I mean, I guess in the area of research generally, but particularly wildlife research, wildfire has become something which people feel that they need to have more understanding of how it impacts. Is that become I mean, we've been trying to understand that for generations, right? Going back to the native people of this area. But I'm guessing that more recently it's become a particular interest in the scientific area.
Right.
Is that something that you've been feeling?
Right, exactly. And that has to do with ongoing changes in what we call the fire regime. So those are the natural fire processes that occur within ecosystems, but things like climate change and land use change are altering how these natural fire systems work. And because of these changes, we don't really know how wildlife respond in response to those changes. So that's kind of the push for understanding this intersection between wildfire and wildlife.
So, and again, I'm sorry to take it up to the kind of big overarching level, but I think frequently what we hear kind of two angles. One is wildfire is natural in California. It is a natural part of our ecosystems here, and many species are very well adapted to it. And so, in fact, it's humans that have the problem with it because we've changed the way we live as well. So it's a good thing. And the other is just wildfire is massively damaging at the levels that we're seeing and the intensity that we're seeing it, and where we are on that, and how your research fits in with that.
Right. So it's confusing because both of those are true. So at one end, fire is a natural part of ecosystems. So many plants and wildlife are adapted and have evolved to co-occur with these types of fire patterns. But on the other end, actions people are having on the land and processes such as climate change are changing how those fire patterns are occurring. So many wildlife and plant species are adapted to these old patterns, but these new forms of global change are changing.
I mean, I guess one thing that I haven't brought in as part of this puzzle at all, and when I start thinking about this, it blows my mind pretty quickly. But one other thing, alongside a changing climate, is we've also been suppressing fire on the landscape for so long, right? So we also have this buildup of vegetation and fuel. So maybe if we bring that down a little bit to the exact situation we've had here with the river fire at Hopland Research and Extension Centre. You came in here fairly fresh after the fire, I'm guessing. In fact, had you seen the site before the fire as well?
I had, yeah.
Yeah. And what was your instant reaction to how you felt the habitats here had been impacted?
It's a pretty dramatic change, at least in the chaparral areas. You can still see the change. Those parts haven't really recovered since. But then in some ways it's surprising. Like there's grass that's almost as tall as your head during the summer, and after the fire.
And that's summer just after the fire,
right?
Right. So when immediately after the fire there was nothing there, and then in the summer it's already wow.
So that's very surprising. And to circle back, like this is part of what we're trying to understand. Like the severity and intensity of these fires are much higher than they have been in the past, and that's really what we want to get at, like how are those changes affecting how people and wildlife are able to respond.
Great. So again, let's bring it back down to the research you're actually doing here, and there are two words that you use then, severity and intensity. And I've been told in other episodes of the Ecology Hour that these are separate things that we talk about. I would use them interchangeably, but it's not appropriate when talking about fire. Could you explain to me what those two terms mean?
Yeah. So fire severity is a measure of the vegetational change. So a high severity fire in like a forested ecosystem would mean all the trees are down, so that it converts it into like a grassland. Intensity is a measure of how hot the fire is.
And how can we know that from a wildfire? I mean, I know we have had studies here in the past where folks have actually tried to be monitoring how hot a prescribed burn might be, but how can we have a sense after the river fire, which was not something we had any control over, of knowing the severity and the intensity?
So we actually, the UC A&R did a very cool project right after the fire where they flew a drone that took remote sensing data over the whole property. And that data is taking images at almost like 3 inches, I think.
Wow.
So with that kind of information, it's possible to like model how severity and intensity progressed from the fire.
So that gives you a kind of overlay to our site on the map to understand, all right, this is the different aspects of the fire across the site. What did you see? Was it very severe? Was there a high intensity in some areas and not others? And any comments on that?
Yeah, definitely at the top, where at the top of the property where it's mostly chaparral and shrubs, very high severity. You can tell there's like ash where the trees have like burned completely, and black skeletons from chaparral that have burned down. And also, sadly, we see like some small mammals that were underground as the fire passed that kind of perished. But
well, maybe what I find really interesting about this site is that we do have these different habitats on this site. So let's start up in the chaparral, where we've talked about it being very intense. And what kinds of species, so you mentioned that you're particularly interested in small mammals. What kinds of species would we expect to find up in that chaparral?
Yeah, chaparral is actually a very interesting and a native habitat that's found uniquely in California, and it actually supports a very large range of bird species, specifically in the chaparral. So part of my research is actually to look at the acoustic monitoring, or use acoustic monitoring to follow which bird species are using which type of habitat and how the fire may have changed those areas of use.
So, all right, stop right there.
Sorry.
This bit's really fascinating to me. So this use of acoustic monitoring. So I know that frequently your research projects have used trail cameras that would take pictures of animals that were passing by. But this is something new that I have not seen used here before, to be using sound to understand what species are using it. And I guess that works particularly well with birds, particularly those which you use a lot of vocalization. Is this something that, again, we're using more acoustic methods now to understand what species are in an area?
Yeah, I think it's really exploding right now. You can use acoustic monitoring for birds as well as amphibians sometimes if they're all calling at night. So it can be really useful to get like an idea of what like frogs are in the area even.
So these are things that you wouldn't be able to capture information about from a trail camera,
No.
at least not easily.
Right. Too small.
Yeah.
But also they're creating ultrasonic monitors now that allow you to record ultrasonic calls from bats.
Wow.
And then there's software that, you can't hear the call, but there's software that will read that and create, like, it'll tell you which species the bat is in that area.
So just like the work that you're doing with trail cameras here, where you generate thousands of pictures from all the trail cameras on the site, and then it takes somebody to go and look at all the pictures, right?
Right.
You now have who knows how many hours of sound recordings, and is that your job to sit and listen to that? How does that work?
So partially. We have, there's luckily a software that we can use that at least helps organize the audio files into similar patterns, so that it collects similar calls into one, so that you just have to identify what that bird is.
But it does still take somebody listening. And can it at least tune out all of this time when there really is only, like, I don't know, background noise that's not of interest, the wind?
Hopefully, yes.
Okay.
I've just started this pilot these last weeks, so I'm still getting my beginning data, but it'll be interesting to go through. I'm learning as many bird calls as I can.
Wow. I find that method very interesting. Anyway, I tend to sidetrack, but that sounds such an interesting method that you're using. So up in the chaparral, you talked about the diversity of bird species, and then you also commented that up in that area you were already noticing immediately after the fire that some of the small mammals that may have tried to go underground wouldn't have made it. Now, is that a fairly common strategy for small mammals to cope with fire?
I mean, they honestly probably don't have very much ability to escape as a fire's coming, depending on how fast it's coming. But the mammals we were seeing were like moles and gophers that probably were underground as the fire came. But that is just proof at how severe the fire was if it was hot enough to penetrate the soil.
Yeah, because if it was just going through a grass fire and it
Right.
was not getting particularly hot, you might see those species making it through, right? But not if you've got a very severe one.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything more you'd like to tell us about the chaparral? So you've got the acoustic monitoring going on up there. Are you also looking to actually try and be trapping up there at all? I know that's another tool that you tend to use for...
Yeah. So we have already done, deer trapping, which is using they're called clover traps, which trap deer overnight, and we go and put GPS collars on them so we can monitor their movement. This is really important now post-fire because normally the chaparral is very dense with vegetation, and that means there's a lot of places for prey like deer to hide. But now that it's all gone, it's very easy to see everything for meters.
So you've had collared deer on our site both before the fire and after the fire.
Right.
And I guess, you're not necessarily at the point yet where you're trying to draw any conclusions, but have you noticed a change in the behavior of where they might use?
Yeah, we had actually a undergrad do a preliminary look at what the results may be, looking at pre and post, and what she could see, Sammy, was that deer potentially were doubling their home range. So maybe using more area to compensate for the loss of resources. We're not sure yet, but that is what we at least saw right after the fire.
And therefore needing to expend more energy as well to find their food sources, right? To
Right.
be moving in larger areas.
Right.
Wow, interesting stuff. So maybe if we consider moving down the site a little bit, so we also have a lot of oak woodland here, and maybe you can express to me some of the other kinds of habitats that we have here that you're able to look at post-fire.
Yeah, so there's oak woodland mixed throughout the property. It's a very important habitat for many different species, including birds and many mammals that we see in our trail cameras. In some of the high severity areas, it doesn't look like those oaks will be coming back. And that's unfortunate because there's a kind of an oak regeneration problem that we talk about in California, where we're not really sure long term whether or not these oaks are replacing themselves with new acorns. And then if we keep going down, we can go into the grassland, which, as I said before, it looks like it just rebounded.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's what you were saying about this really high grass.
But it makes sense because, those grasses are adapted to respond well to disturbance. Yeah. So if having a fire come through once after, I don't know when the last fire was.
Yeah, a long time ago, as far as I'm aware. I don't know. It was in the time that the universities owned the site, so maybe over 50 years, certainly.
Yeah. Many of them are invasive too, so it's...
So is there maybe some hope that in those areas, those grassland areas with a lot of non-native grass species, that there maybe would knock back those non-native species a little? And
yeah, there has been some research looking at how fire can, the role fire plays in maybe promoting the integrity of native grasses. I think this is not my specialty, but using repeated potentially prescribed burns may enhance having native plants or grasses inhabit those areas.
I know it's another area that is an area of interest on this site for other researchers. So it'll be interesting to see what we can gather after in a few years' time of the areas that we did have prescribed burns for the grasses versus the wildfire areas too. So we've moved into the grassland now, and I'm interested. You've said that they maybe dealt the best. Maybe that's not the right word for it, but they've come back quickly.
Right.
And so what kind of species would we expect to find in grassland, apart from the plant species that we're talking about?
Lots of small mammals like voles, mice. Me and Vishal have done some small mammal capture work in some of the grasslands, and have had some pretty good success.
So tell us a bit about small mammal capture work. What does that involve? You talked about clover traps for deer, but this is a different scale we're talking about now. Mm-hmm.
Like intrinsically, they're kind of the same, where you're using like a little device to capture animals and reuse bait, which is like oats or bird seed, to lure them inside. We normally set these traps at night, and then overnight we get the nocturnal rodents that come in, and there's basically a little treadle inside of it that closes the door. And then after night, in the morning, we come back and see what rodents we caught the night before, and we do our measurements, identify the species, and sometimes ear tag them so we can know which individuals are in the area.
So these are the kinds of species that I think probably living around here, we know they're around. We tend to just call them mice and just have a blanket term and say, oh, it's another mouse. But actually there's a lot of diversity in some of the small mammals here. So can you introduce us to some of the different species that we see around here? Maybe those that are really common that we see frequently, and those that might be a bit more interesting, a bit more exciting to you when you see them.
So the one we caught, it's called a deer mouse. It's probably the most common of the Paramiscus mouse species or genus. But I've also seen the pinion mouse, which is very cute. It's like, it looks like a deer mouse, but they have very, very big ears.
Oh, gosh. And
they like the more scrubby, rocky areas. And then really cool is seeing wood rats, dusky-footed wood rats. And we've seen a couple of those too this season.
That's exciting. So they're the ones that build these massive homes, right? You see big bundles of sticks occasionally, and that might be a wood rat nest. Have you come across any nesting areas around here?
Yep. We actually saw one down when we were leading that summer camp. I think I saw one, like a wooded home.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah,
because they have quite a complex kind of structure in there. I've heard, and I'm always nervous that sometimes I'm excited to hear these kinds of stories, and I'm not quite sure how much is true. But am I right in thinking they almost have sort of separate rooms in these structures?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
No, okay. Well, as I say, I'm keen to listen to those sorts of stories, but sometimes more research needs to be done. So those are the main things that you've been finding. Is there anything else that you found which has been a surprise or a real interest to you yet, or?
In terms of small mammal captures, no, not yet. We've only done some like preliminary work. It's actually that part of my project. We'll be looking at how those small mammals influence the regeneration of oaks.
Wow!
So we kind of talked about it earlier, but oak seedlings and saplings are normally predated on by rodents. So we're building these exclosures that exclude some exclude deer, some exclude nothing, and we're going to compare how those different oak seedlings and those exclosures fare, depending on what you exclude.
Gosh, so an exclosure that keeps small mammals out must be quite a project. How on earth do you keep potentially burrowing, climbing little creatures out of an area?
Yeah, you have to build it pretty sturdy. We're gonna dig a foot into the ground to lay pretty much a underground fence to block gophers and other moles and stuff from getting in, and then we have about a 3 feet high fence that's supposed to prevent them from climbing in. But that's part of the reason we'll be doing small mammal trapping in those areas, just to monitor to make sure they're working, but also see the kinds of species that may be predating on these species of oaks.
On the young oaks coming up. Really interesting. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Ecology Hour this evening. It's been great to visit with our researchers who are studying the site following the wildfire of 2018 and hearing how wildlife species are recovering. Everything from ticks to deer and mice. Please remember that if you have any comments about the programme, we'd love to hear from you. You can visit us at our Facebook page at the Hopland Research and Extension Centre, or find us on Twitter and Instagram at HoplandRec. Or you could always send me an email. hbird, HBIRD, at ucanr.edu. We'd love to hear from you and find out what you'd like to be hearing on the Ecology Hour into the future. I look forward to speaking to you again on the Ecology Hour next month, and in the meantime, do stay safe.